The teller at Farmers and Merchants State Bank set my grandfather's ledger back across the counter like it was something she didn't want touching her sleeve, and told me the note was still due on the 23rd of July, hail or no hail, boy or no boy. It was Tuesday, July the 14th, 1959, and outside the window, the sky over Comanche County, Kansas, had gone the color of a day-old bruise, green-gray and low, though the storm itself had already come and gone the night before, dropping stones the size of pullet eggs on 11,000 acres of wheat that had, up until 6 o'clock the previous evening, stood 18 inches high and 3 weeks from cutting. 19 days. That's what the county extension man had chalked on the board outside the co-op that morning, the number scratched under a hand-lettered sign that read, "Harvest Countdown," the kind of thing farmers like to joke about over coffee at the Rexall counter. 19 days until the wheat would be hard enough, dry enough, standing enough to run a header through. By noon, somebody had come along and scratched through the 19 and written 11, because that was how much time was left before what hadn't been flattened outright would start to shatter loose from the head and fall to rot on the ground, seed corn for nobody, income for nobody, and the banknote, $4,200 against 160 acres and every piece of iron on it, would come due whether there was a crop standing to pay it or not. I was 18 years old, and I had exactly $41 in a coffee can under the floorboard of the machine shed, and a name in that county that men said out loud without shame, right in front of me, the way you'd say weather, the scrap kid. Because I'd spent 3 summers hauling dead iron out of fence rows and hog wallows and the back 40 of every farm within 9 miles, dragging home crankshafts and magnetos and gear housings nobody else wanted, piling them under the lean-to my grandfather built in 1938, the same lean-to he died under, of a heart that quit on him in March, 11 weeks before any of this. The loan officer folded her hands on the counter and told me, not unkindly, that the bank would be sending men around Thursday to look at what was salvageable and that I ought to think about what a boy my age could reasonably expect to hold on to once the accounting was done. She said it the way you'd tell a child the dog had to be put down. I didn't argue with her. I had learned that much from the ledger already, the one my grandfather kept behind a loose board in the barn wall since 1931. Since 1931, in a hand so small and even, I'd needed my mother's sewing glasses to read the first pages. He'd written the weather on the left side and the money on the right, every single day, like the two things were kin to each other, which out here they were. June the wheat came in, October the note came due. He'd underlined that part twice, in red pencil, the only red pencil in the whole ledger. October 15th, principal and interest, Farmers State Bank of Coldwater, $4,200 at 6%, and beside it, in a hand not his own, my grandmother's, added after he was gone, paid how. I did the arithmetic the way he'd have done it, standing up, not sitting down, because sitting down made a man forget he was supposed to be moving. 19 days to harvest. 19 days between the 6th of June, a Tuesday, and whatever Tuesday the wheat would stand tall enough and dry enough and stubborn enough to cut, and every one of those days had a price on it now that hadn't been there in March, when it had only been grief. The bank sent a man named Del Aycock around on the Thursday just like Mrs. Halstead promised, and he walked the machine shed with a clipboard and a look on his face like he was appraising a dead horse for the price of the hide. He didn't touch anything. He wrote things down. He asked me twice, not cruelly, if I understood what a lien was, and I told him yes, sir, and he seemed surprised I knew the word, which told me more about what he expected from a boy standing in a lean-to full of rust than it told me about the lien. What he didn't write down, because he didn't know to look for it, was the farmall under the tarp in the far corner, the one built out of 2 dead ones, a 39 and a 41, both condemned by men who knew tractors better than they knew patience, with a rewound magneto and a crankshaft I'd had turned down at a machine shop in Pratt for $11 I didn't have and paid off in eggs. He didn't know about the McCormick binder rebuilt from parts hauled out of Ostrander's fence row the summer before, back when Verl Ostrander still called me the boy who collects junk to my face, and meant it as something between an insult and a warning. And he didn't know about the Babbitt, the tins of it stacked on a shelf my grandfather had poured himself, and the mold, and the little forge in the corner that still smelled of coal dust if you put your face close enough. 19 days. That was what the ledger owed me, and what the wheat owed the bank, and what nobody in that county believed a boy could turn into anything but a story they told at the feed store, the way you tell a story about weather nobody could have stopped. I closed the ledger. I went out to the shed, and that was the morning, the 9th of June, a Friday, that the sky over the western section turned the color of a bruise before it had any business doing so. The barometer in the kitchen window, the one my grandfather had nailed to the sash in 1938 after losing 4 acres of oats to a storm he swore he'd seen coming, sat at 29.6 and dropping when I came back in for coffee. I didn't need the glass to tell me. The dog knew first. She'd gone under the porch by 6:30, and she didn't come out for supper, and she didn't come out that whole day. By 9, the wind had a smell to it, wet metal and turned soil, the smell that comes before hail and not before rain, though most men in that county couldn't tell you the difference and would argue with you if you tried. I drove the truck, a '51 Ford with a bed full of loose chain and a radiator that ran hot past 40 miles an hour, out to the Kessler section where I had 80 acres of winter wheat standing at maybe 11 inches, heads full, 2 shades short of the gold it would need to be in 19 days. I stood at the fence line and watched the cloud come over Pawnee Rock like something poured rather than blown, greenish at the base the way my grandfather's notebook said to watch for. The pages I'd read so many times the spine had cracked at that exact entry. June, he'd written, no year given, watch the green, not the black. It hit the Ostrander place first. I heard it before I saw it, a sound like a freight train running on gravel instead of rail, and then it was over the section line and into my wheat, stones the size of quarters and worse. Some men swore later the size of hen's eggs out past the Dressler farm, though I never saw one bigger than a walnut myself. It lasted maybe 6 minutes. It felt considerably longer, standing there with my hat pulled down and my collar up, watching stalks that had stood 11 inches tall get beaten down to nothing in patches, other patches spared for no reason I could see, the way hail always plays favorites without explaining itself. When it passed, I drove into town, because that was where the news would be, and Pratt's Main Street had that stunned quiet a county gets after a bad storm, men standing in doorways looking at a sky gone clean and blue and indifferent, as if it hadn't just cost somebody a year's income in 6 minutes. I heard it outside the co-op before anyone told me directly. Ostrander's new combine, the one the bank had helped him finance that spring, had taken a dent clean through the header housing, and 2 more machines besides his were down in yards across the valley, and the wheat that hadn't been flattened was standing there ripening on a clock nobody controlled, and now there were 11 days left instead of 19, and I stood on that sidewalk doing arithmetic I didn't want to do. 11 days. I said it under my breath twice, the way you test a number to see if it changes shape in your mouth, and it didn't. It just sat there being true. Inside the co-op, the talk was already moving faster than the men could keep up with it. Ostrander wanting a replacement header shipped up from the international dealer in Salina, 60-some miles south, and Hollis Dieter behind the counter saying flat out that the earliest anybody could promise was 10 days if the part was even in stock, which nobody could confirm on a Thursday afternoon with the phone lines still down in 2 exchanges from the storm. 10 days on a promise, 11 days on a field. I did that arithmetic too, and it came out the same ugly way twice. I bought a pound of coffee I didn't need, mostly so I'd have a reason to keep standing there listening, and I learned that the Voss place had lost their McCormick Deering sickle bar entire, sheared clean where a chunk of ice the size of a fist had come through the guardrail, and that the Pruitt boys had a combine that would still run but wouldn't cut straight, veering left like a dog favoring a bad hip, and that all three of those men had wheat, standing in fields that didn't care one bit whose machine was broken. Somebody said the elevator in Pratt was already talking about docking anything that came in touched by damp or delay, which meant every day lost wasn't just a day, it was money, bleeding out of a check that hadn't been written yet. I walked back out to the truck with the coffee riding on the seat beside me, and sat there a minute before I turned the key, watching the sky do exactly what my grandfather always said it would do after a hail, go quiet and pale and falsely gentle, like it was embarrassed. 19 days had felt tight already. 11 felt like a door swinging shut with my hand still in the frame. I thought about the barn then, the way you think about a person you trust when the rest of the room's gone strange on you, not deciding anything yet, just letting the shape of it sit in the back of my mind. The farmall, the binder, the bearings I'd poured myself in February with nothing but a coffee can and patience and a page of his handwriting propped against the forge wall so I wouldn't get the ratio wrong. I drove home slower than I needed to, past the Ostrander place where the dented header sat crooked in the yard like something shot, past fields where the hail had drawn its own uneven map across the county, sparing this quarter section, ruining that one, and I kept thinking 11 days, until it stopped sounding like a number and started sounding like a question nobody in Pratt County had yet thought to ask me directly. The question came anyway, sooner than I expected, and it came from a place I didn't figure on. I'd pulled into the yard a little after 6, the light doing that thin gold thing it does before a storm season turns mean, and there was a Ford parked crooked by the gate, not Ostrander's, not the bank's, but the county extension agent's, a man named Delmar Huss who'd shaken my hand exactly twice in my life, and both times looked past me like he was counting fence posts. He was standing by the barn door with his hat off, which should have told me something before he opened his mouth. He asked if I'd heard about the Ostrander combine. I said I'd seen the header. He said seen wasn't heard, and then he told me what I already half knew from the shape of things. The bank's new international had thrown a rod pushing through wet ground trying to beat the second front, and there wasn't a working combine left standing between the Sims place and the county line that hadn't been rented out 3 times over by men with more acres and older names than mine. He didn't ask me for help. He asked me, straight out, standing in my own yard, with his hat in his hands, like it cost him something, whether the machines in that barn were real, or whether they were, in his words, just something to keep a boy busy. I didn't answer him right away. I've learned that much from my grandfather's silences, the ones I used to think were just him being tired. I walked past him into the barn instead, past the smell of neatsfoot oil and old diesel, and the particular dust that settles on a thing built out of 2 dead things, and I put my hand on the farmall's fender the way you'd put a hand on a horse's neck before you asked it for anything. Huss followed me in. He looked at the binder a long time, at the McCormick decal half worn off the sickle bar, at the Babbitt bearings gleaming dull silver where I'd fit them that February with the coffee can and the notebook page pinned to the wall. He asked whose handwriting that was. I told him. He didn't say anything to that, just nodded once, like a man filing something away he wasn't ready to say out loud yet, and he asked when I figured I could run. 11 days, I told him, maybe 10, if the wind held. He put his hat back on. He said the Sims place alone was 240 acres of turkey red winter wheat standing at 14% moisture and dropping, and that Verl Ostrander wasn't a man who'd ask a boy for anything, not even drowning. I already knew that part too. I asked him how he knew what Verley Ostrander would or wouldn't ask for, and Huss said he'd farmed next to the man for 22 years and had never once borrowed so much as a crescent wrench off him, not because Verley wouldn't lend it, but because Verley would remember you owed him something for the rest of your natural life. That was the first true thing anybody had told me about the man since the storm. Everything else had come second-hand, through the feed store or the diner counter, the way most things did in that county, filtered through 6 mouths before they reached mine, and every mouth added something. I'd heard he had the new International Combine sitting under a tarp in his yard, with the header stove clean through. I'd heard the bank had floated him the note on it in March, and he'd made exactly one payment. I'd heard he hadn't come into town since Tuesday. Huss didn't correct any of it, and didn't confirm it either. He just stood there running his thumb along the edge of the sickle bar, testing a knife section for burr, an old habit I recognized because it was the same motion my grandfather used to make without thinking, the same motion the notebook described in its own dry hand. Check every third section, replace if the edge won't hold a fingernail. I hadn't shown him that page. He'd found it himself. Outside, the wind had shifted west and dropped the temperature 4 degrees since we'd walked in, and the barometer needle on the nail by the door, an old brass thing my grandmother had hung there in 1938 and nobody had ever taken down, had crept back a hair, which meant nothing good. I counted the days again in my head, the way I'd been doing every hour since Sunday. 11 from the storm, 2 gone already sorting parts, and 1 more sitting here talking, which left 8 if the wheat held its moisture and the machines held their welds, and less than that if either one didn't. Huss asked whether I'd told anyone about the Sims acreage yet, whether Delbert Sims himself knew a scrap metal boy with 2 dead tractors welded into one was fixing to cut his crop. I said I hadn't told him anything. I said I figured a man in Sims's position would rather hear it from a full field than from me standing in his kitchen, making promises I couldn't back with anything but a rebuilt farmall and a page of my grandfather's handwriting. Huss looked at me a long moment, the way you look at a colt to see if it'll take a saddle, and then he said the wheat wouldn't wait on anybody's pride, mine included, and that he'd be back before daylight to help me load the binder. He didn't wait for me to answer. He climbed back into his truck, a '51 Chevy, with a bed full of loose chain and a spare tire that hadn't held air since Eisenhower's first term, and the engine caught on the second try, the way it always did, coughing blue smoke into air that already smelled like rain that wasn't coming. I stood in the yard until his taillights dropped over the rise by the Lundquist section, and then I went back into the shop because 8 days doesn't stop counting itself down just because a man you respect drove off satisfied. The binder sat under the single bulb with its canvas apron half-laced, looking less like a machine and more like something excavated. I'd pulled the Pittman arm off a McCormick that Orville Dietz had left to rust behind his hog barn since the Truman administration, and the sickle bar came off a different rig entirely, one my grandfather had cannibalized in 1949, according to a note in the ledger that just said, "Took the bar, left the rest, man didn't want money for it anyway." I ran my thumb along the weld where I'd joined the two, and it held cold and clean, no give in it at all, which was the only mercy I'd been handed all week. The Babbitt bearings were the part that kept me up. I'd poured them Tuesday night in the forge my grandfather built out of a truck brake drum and a hand crank blower, following instructions written in pencil on the back page of the notebook, half erased by 40 years of the book being handled with greasy hands. Melt the Babbitt slow. Don't let it smoke. That means it's burning, not melting. Pour in one motion. Don't stop. Don't second-guess it once it's moving. I hadn't stopped. I hadn't second-guessed it, not out loud anyway. Though my hands had shook enough after that, I dropped the ladle and had to fish it out of the sand before it cooled wrong. I checked the bearings again that night, running my fingers along the seam where the new metal met the old race, feeling for the roughness that would mean I'd have to pull it all and start over with 2 days less than I had now. It felt smooth. It felt, if I let myself believe it, exactly like the ones in the photograph tucked in the ledger's back pages, my grandfather standing beside a binder that could have been this one's grandfather, squinting into 1931's sun, a wheat field behind him that hadn't shattered yet either. I banked the shop stove, killed the bulb, and walked back to the house under a sky gone the color of an old bruise, counting 8 down to 7 in my head before I even reached the porch steps, because Huss was right about one thing above everything else he'd said that night. The wheat wasn't going to wait on anybody, least of all me. 7 o'clock the next morning found me back at the shop before the frost had burned off the fence wire and I didn't eat, though I'd meant to. I'd told myself the night before that I'd sit down to eggs like a person with sense, but the light coming gray through the shop windows pulled me out of the house before the coffee finished dripping, and I carried a cup out with me instead. Black, no sugar, because sugar was for people who had time to enjoy things. The bearing had set clean overnight. I pulled the Babbitt cap and turned it in my hands under the bulb, checking the pour line where the new metal met the old race, and it held tighter than anything I'd bought new from the co-op catalog the winter before, tighter than the ones that had failed twice already on the McCormick before I understood why. My grandfather's notebook had a line about it, penciled thin and faded near the spine. Pour hot, pour slow. Don't trust your eye, trust the feel of the ladle going heavy. And I'd read that sentence maybe 40 times since Tuesday without understanding it until my own hands did the understanding for me. I set the bearing back into the race and turned the crank by hand. It spun without catching, without the grinding hitch that had haunted the sickle drive since I'd first dragged the binder out of the scrap row behind the Hauser place 4 years back. Back when it was nothing but a rust-colored skeleton half sunk in quackgrass and I was 14 and getting laughed at for wanting it. By 9, I had the pitman arm reattached and the canvas aprons cinched down, and I ran the whole mechanism dry for 10 minutes straight, listening the way my grandfather had taught me to listen, not for what was wrong, but for the one sound that didn't belong among all the sounds that did. There wasn't one. I stood there in the cold shop with grease to my elbows and let myself believe, for maybe the first time since the hailstorm, that I might actually make it to the field with 3 machines instead of 2. 6 days. I did the arithmetic without wanting to. 410 acres left standing across 4 farms. The wheat past the soft dough stage and hardening fast. Every day of sun both a mercy and a threat. Ostrander's borrowed combine still sat dead in his yard. The bank's paint barely dulled, and word had gotten around by way of the feed store that he'd called the dealer in Salina twice, and gotten nothing but a promise and a shrug. I hitched the binder behind the farmall that afternoon and took it out past the windbreak, into the near section, just to see if it would cut standing wheat the way it had cut air in the shop. The header dropped, the reel turned, and behind me, the canvas carried the first bound sheaf of the season, up and over, dropping it whole into the field, like something that had never stopped working at all. I stopped the tractor in the middle of the field and just looked at it. A single bound sheaf, lying there in the stubble, tied tight as anything my grandfather ever knotted by hand in his years before he could afford a binder at all. I climbed down and picked it up. The twine held. The heads were clean. No shatter, no loss scattered in the header, the way I'd feared, with a rebuilt canvas, and a knotter I'd had to retime twice, with a feeler gauge and a prayer. 5 days. I ran the binder the rest of that afternoon until the light went orange and long across the section, and I didn't stop until I'd put down 6 acres, and the dog had given up following the machine, and gone to lie in the shade of the fence line instead. 6 acres wasn't much against 410, but it was 6 acres that hadn't existed as anything but scrap metal 11 days before, and I let that sit in my chest the whole walk back to the house, past the barn, where the ledger waited behind its board, like it had waited for 40 years already, and could wait a little longer yet. Word travels faster in that county than weather does. By Thursday morning there were 3 trucks in the yard before I'd finished the milking, Ostrander's boy, and Mrs. Halverson's hired man, and old man Trudeau himself, standing by his rusted-out Chevy with his hat in his hands like he was at a funeral instead of a farm. They'd heard about the binder. They wanted to know if it was true, if the scrap kid had really built a second machine out of a scrap pile behind his grandfather's shop, and whether it could cut wheat that wasn't his own. I told them I didn't know yet. I told them 4 days, maybe 5, and I'd know for certain once I'd taken it through a full section without the canvas slipping or the knotter missing a tie. Trudeau didn't say much. He just looked at the farmall, and then at the binder hitched behind it, patched and painted with mismatched enamel from 3 different tractors, and he nodded the way men in that county nodded when they'd decided something and weren't going to say it out loud. That night I sat at the kitchen table with the notebook open in front of me, the one with my grandfather's hand in it, cramped and certain, page after page of numbers and dates going back to 1931. I found the entry about the Babbitt bearings, the recipe for the metal, tin and copper, and lead in exact proportions, and beside it, in different ink, a note added later. Poured a second set, spring of 34, hard year, held anyway. 4 days. 4 days meant nothing until I put a number to them, so I did what my grandfather did in that same notebook every hard spring. I broke the problem into hours instead of days, because hours were a thing a man could actually hold in his hands. 96 hours. Minus sleep, if I slept at all, minus the hour each morning the diesel needed to warm before it would pull true, minus whatever time the knotter would steal from me if the twine ran cheap and frayed the way the last spool from the co-op had. I went out to the shop before first light on Thursday, the 22nd, with frost still silvering the window glass, and I laid the Babbitt recipe out on the workbench under the lamp like a man reading scripture. Tin, copper, lead, in the proportions my grandfather had written twice, once in 1931, hopeful, and once in 1934, hard won. I melted the metal in the same crucible he'd used, black with 40 years of soot, and poured it into the mold he'd carved himself, the wood scorched at the edges from all the pores before mine. My hands didn't shake. I noticed that the way you notice weather, a fact, not a feeling. The bearing set overnight while I slept 2 hours on the shop floor with my coat for a blanket, and when I fitted it into the housing at dawn, the shaft turned smoother than it had in the whole 3 years I'd been running that farmall on castoffs and prayer. Friday I took the binder through the Kessler's East 40, full width, no rest, and it held. The canvas didn't slip. The knotter tied every sheaf clean, over and over, a small mechanical mercy repeating itself 1,000 times an acre. Old man Kessler stood at the fence line for an hour without saying a word, and when he finally spoke it wasn't to me, it was to his son, low, the way men speak when they don't want to be overheard admitting something. Saturday the sky turned the color of a bruise by 4 in the afternoon, and everyone in 3 farms worth of fields looked up at the same time. It passed north of us, thank God, dumped its hail on somebody else's ground, and I stood in the yard afterward with dust in my teeth and counted what was left. 2 days, if the wheat was going to hold. 2 days, and one field left that mattered more than the rest. Verl Ostrander's, the man who'd never once looked at me like I was anything but the scrap kid, and whose broken bank combine still sat rusting in his yard like an accusation. Sunday morning, I drove out to the Ostrander place before the dew burned off, the farmall pulling the binder behind it, both machines ticking and settling in the cool air, the way tired animals do. Verle was on his porch with a cup of coffee he wasn't drinking, and he watched me turn in through his gate without moving, like a man deciding whether a thing in front of him was real. I didn't wait for him to invite me in. I drove straight to the edge of his wheat, cut the engine, and walked the field the way my grandfather taught me, hands trailing through the heads, feeling for the give that meant the grain was ready to run, the stiffness that meant it wasn't. It was ready, past ready. A day, maybe less, before it started shattering on its own, kernels falling into the dirt for nothing, 6 months of a man's work turning to feed for mice. Verle came down off the porch slow, the way older men do when their knees have opinions about it. He stood at the edge of his own field like a stranger there. "That thing runs," he said. "Not a question. It runs." He looked at the binder a long time, at the welds, at the wheel that wasn't a McCormick wheel, at the reel I'd built from 2 others that used to be scrap in his own fence-a-row, hauled off his place 2 years back when he'd called me a name behind my back that got repeated to me anyway, the way those things always are. I watched him work it out, watched the arithmetic cross his face, what that scrap had become, what it was about to save him from. "Your bank machine still broke?" I asked, not unkind. Ostrander Grain Company, he said, is sitting in my yard in 4 pieces, and the parts man in Wichita Falls says 3 weeks. He said it flat, the way a man says a thing he's already made peace with hating. I've got 2 days left in me before the grain won't wait for anybody's parts man. He nodded. Didn't apologize. Men like him didn't. Not out loud, not yet. But he walked to his own gate and opened it wide, and stood back from it the way you'd stand back from a door you weren't sure you had the right to hold open anymore. I started the tractor. The binder's canvas caught, the reel turned, and 40 acres of wheat that had stood ready to shatter into nothing began, sheaf by sheaf, to come down clean into the grandfather's knot. My grandfather never lived to see finished. 2 days left turned into none owed. We cut his 40 acres by dusk on the 11th day, and I want to be exact about that, because exactness is the only honesty a farm ledger understands. 11 days from the hailstorm that took every combine in the county down to steel skeletons, 9 days of running 3 machines that had no business running at all, and a debt of $1,140 that was due at the Farmers State Bank of Clay County 4 days later, on a Tuesday, the 15th. We paid it on the 11th, not in cash, in shares. Bushels weighed out at the elevator under 4 different names, converted at the going rate, carried into town in a coffee can, and counted out on the counter by a teller who didn't ask where a boy my age had gotten that kind of money, because by then, everyone in 3 townships already knew. That night, I went out to the barn with a lantern, the way my grandfather must have gone out 100 times before me, and I found the loose board behind the workbench where the ledger lived, the one he'd started in 1931, in pencil, that had gone soft and gray with age. I read it start to finish for maybe the last time. His hand, then mine. 40 years of a farm's whole life measured in seed corn and vet bills and one bad winter after another. I took his pen, the one still in the drawer, and I wrote the only line that mattered. Paid in full, and the date, and nothing else. No flourish. He wouldn't have wanted one. I still have the notebook. I still have the farmall, though it runs different now, quieter, the way a thing runs once it's finally been asked to do what it was built for. I don't know what happened to the name they called me. It just stopped, the way names do when the thing they were mocking turns out to be the thing that saved you. Here's what I've learned, and it's not complicated enough to preach about. Nobody looks twice at a boy hauling rust home in a truck bed until the day the rust is the only thing left standing. The men who called me soft weren't wrong that I was young. They were wrong about what young meant. It meant I hadn't yet learned to throw things away. If there's a barn on your place nobody's opened in 40 years, or a notebook in a drawer somebody kept for reasons they never explained, go look. Not because there's treasure in it. There rarely is. Not the kind you're hoping for. But there's usually an answer to something, and you won't know what question it answers until you're standing in a field with 2 days left and no other choice. That's the whole of it. If it was worth your time, stay a while longer, and tell me, down below, what's still sitting unopened in yours.